Welcome to the workshop on home education, where to begin, presented by the Mississippi Home Educators Association. We are Jeff and Lisa Barber. We have 5 children. We have 3 daughters, ages 27, 26, and 22, and we have 2 sons, ages 17 and 13. We have home educated all of our children from birth. I have been on the board of the Mississippi Home Educators Association since the year 2000, and I think for 18 or 19 of those years, Lisa and I have done this beginning homeschool workshop at our annual conference that MHEA hosts each year. We didn't have a conference in 2020, and we thought it might be helpful if we did this workshop in video format and posted it so that it could be of benefit to others. So we're going to try to walk you through beginning home education. This is intended for those who have just begun home education or perhaps are thinking about it and want to know more about it so that they can make an informed decision. Now, I want to give you one disclaimer. We are not going to be covering everything that you need to know about home education. There's simply no way we could do that in an hour, hour and a half workshop. As a result, this workshop will not be exhaustive, but it may be exhausting. When it's over, you may feel absolutely exhausted. It may feel as if you've been taking a sip out of an open fire hose. We're going to move fairly rapidly through this material, and you probably will not be able to take detailed notes, but we do have a handout that accompanies this presentation, and it includes an outline of our presentation as well as a copy of Mississippi's homeschooling law. Now, for those of you who may be watching this video for years after 2020, the law may change on a year-to-year basis. You'll certainly need to update that information as appropriate. Now, most people think of homeschoolers as extreme right-wing Christians. That's not always the case. A Barna research poll a number of years ago showed that almost half of the families in the United States who home educate do not profess to be Christian. And a number of years ago, there was actually a Buddhist homeschool group on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. Now, MHEA desires to help homeschoolers of all stripes, and we have no desire to disparage others, but we unapologetically focus on Christian home education. Now, what do we mean by Christian? Well, someone is a Christian who has believed the gospel, which the Apostle Paul summarizes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where he says, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried, he was raised from the dead, and appeared unto many witnesses before ascending into heaven. And someone who believes that message as a Christian receives the forgiveness of their sins. So that's what we're talking about here. Now, why do we focus on distinctly Christian home education? Well, one reason is that it's the most hands-on way of putting into practice Deuteronomy chapter 6. There, Moses told the people of Israel as they were about to enter the promised land, you shall talk about these things when you get up in the morning, when you go to bed at night, as you walk along the road, etc. And so, as we home educate our children, we are literally walking through the day with our children, teaching them both academics and doctrine. A second reason why we focus on Christian home education is that teaching your children at home is a demanding, full-time job, and it's very difficult at times. And at least from our perspective, apart from the help of our Lord Jesus Christ, we would not dream of attempting this journey. Now, our goal is not to discourage you, not by any means, but we also want to be honest about what you're getting into. We don't want to lead you down the primrose path. Home education is in reality a calling. It is a vocation. If you've never home educated before, it is going to take time to learn what to do and how to do it. It's great on-the-job training, and there is a lot of trial and error to it. It will put you on your face before the Lord, and that's a great place to be, because James 1:5 says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. We have broken down this topic of home education into its 2 most basic parts, the home and the education. We're going to flip those just a bit. We're going to start with the education part. First, let's talk about 3 aspects of education. We're going to talk about the children's education, the parents' education, and then the law on home education in Mississippi. Now, let's begin with the children's education. And as we approach that, there are 8 questions that we strongly encourage you to ask yourself and answer before you get started. The first question is, why are we doing this? What are our motives and our goals? Is God leading us to do it? Are we attempting to avoid secular philosophy and negative influences in public or private school? Are we doing it to reap the proven academic benefits? Do we want to spend more time with our kids and teach them godly principles by shepherding their hearts? Are we trying to avoid school shootings? Are we trying to avoid bullying? Are we trying to avoid COVID-19? These are just a few examples of reasons why people home educate their children, and there may be others as well. Now, your answers to that question just might give you insight on how long you are going to last on the homeschooling journey. If you're not philosophically dedicated to home education, it is questionable how long you will last. Home educators differ very widely, and they have a variety of motives for why they home educate. Believe it or not, there is no homeschool stereotype. Every homeschool is different because every family is different. You should be clear about your own goals and purposes so that you can give clear answers to those who ask you why you do it, and so that you know exactly why you're doing it. Now, as a side note, throughout this presentation, we're going to be using the terms we and our because we're assuming that you will be answering these questions with your spouse. Some of you might be single or widowed or have a deployed spouse, and you can still successfully home educate. But if you have a spouse in the home, really and truly, it should be a team effort. Even if mom is the primary teacher, dad will constantly be needed for guidance, for support, and occasionally a shoulder to cry on. And it is good to see at our conference each year, we more and more have been seeing men participate. And I'm glad to see that. There was a time when home education was largely a women's movement. But as I said, ideally it is a team effort. And I'm going to speak directly to the men a little bit later. And then a second question you should ask and answer is, who will do the teaching? For most families, mom does the teaching, at least the teaching that goes on during the day when dad is normally at work. In some families, dad teaches a subject or two in the afternoons or evenings when he comes home from work. In a handful of families, dad stays home and does the daytime teaching depending on his work schedule. In reality, life is education. So be on your guard against focusing all of your energies on the formal aspects of education. Grab what we call teachable moments, opportunities where you can give real-life examples of things while you're doing the teaching. I am an ordained pastor. I'm also a lawyer as far as my vocation is concerned, but a number of years ago, I had preached a sermon at our church, and it was a hot August day, and I finished preaching. We were heading home. I was exhausted, couldn't wait to eat and take a much-needed nap when our van's tire went flat. So I got out of the vehicle and I was, sweating in my suit, trying to remember all the verses about joy that I had just preached about. And I had the wheel off and I suddenly realized this is a teachable moment. So I pulled everybody out of the van and had them look under the wheel well. And I'm not a mechanic by any means, but I know a little bit about cars. And so I explained in general how the hydraulic braking system of a vehicle works. And the older children remember that lesson to this day. That was not something formal. It was not something planned. It was just something happened that we seized upon. Very often when our children were little, we would be at a restaurant and the waitress would hand me the check and I would say to the kids, what would happen if we left here without paying for the food? And I would explain to them that this would be stealing. This is morally wrong. Now again, that's not something that is formal. It's not something necessarily planned. It's just one of those opportunities that you look out for and then capitalize upon. So education is not just about table time and worksheets and written assignments. Now as a footnote to this, I encourage men to be active and teach when you can. Any man can come home from work in the evening and sit down with a first grader and let that first grader read a primer or do other things. There are things you can do as men to teach your children, and I strongly encourage you to do that. Now, when answering this question of who does the teaching, I want to give you this word of caution. No one sends their children to a home school. Home education occurs primarily in your home. If you send your kids away from home for the bulk of their lessons, you are sending them into some kind of non-homeschool system, no matter what they call it, and even if it's physically in a home. That is some kind of non-homeschool system regardless. And I point this out because we've actually had people call us before and ask if they could pay us to homeschool their children. And while certainly the money would be nice, we just explained to them that that's really not home education. I also mention it during this COVID time because there are going to be individuals who are going to choose to use public school at home. And by our definition of home education, that is not home education. That we're not disparaging that. We're just saying that that does not meet our definition of home education. Now, it's true that many home educators do participate in co-ops or study groups, or they use tutors for specific subjects such as music or biology or chemistry or higher math. We hired someone to teach our children piano. This isn't the same thing as sending them away from home for the bulk of their subjects. This is simply hiring out a few subjects to supplement what the parents are doing in the home. Now, some parents will say, well, I never went to college, or I have some kind of obscure degree like, I don't know, ancient Icelandic languages or something like that. So how can I teach my kids? Well, studies have shown that there is absolutely no correlation between the education level or the type of education of the parents and the quality of the children's education at home. If you understand some basic theories, if you understand educational philosophies and learning styles, and since you know your children better than anyone else, or at least you should know your children better than anyone else, then the substantive subjects will, for the most part, come with time. If you instill in them a love of learning, your education level or area of expertise will be largely irrelevant. Homeschooling is not the Vulcan mind meld. Now, I grew up in the 60s, and so I was a big Star Trek fan as a kid. And those of you who are familiar with it know that, Spock would do the Vulcan mind meld between himself and someone else. Home education is not the Vulcan mind meld. It's not pouring all the information from your brain into your children's brains. With the right training and motivation, your kids should begin to teach themselves, to become autodidacts. And then the difficulty may be holding them back. One example of this, when our girls were young, my wife read to them from the book series Little House on the Prairie by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And so they were very excited about pioneer and the history of pioneers and things like that. And they got interested in pioneer living. And so they got some books about that period, and they taught themselves to make homemade butter and applesauce and hand-sewn doll clothes. My oldest son decided that he wanted to learn about turtles. We took him to the library and he checked out all kinds of books on turtles, and he could tell you more about turtles than you ever wanted to know about. Now, these were things that we didn't plan on. These things weren't part of their curriculum, but we gave them the tools to be able to teach themselves and the excitement about it, and so they were able to teach themselves. Those are just two examples. There are many more that I could give as they've gotten older. Now, another part of this is, or another benefit, is that you will be learning along with your children. My wife and I have learned things by teaching our children that we either missed the first time around or weren't paying attention to. And so one of the great fringe benefits of home education is that the entire family is being educated together. And now I'm going to turn the program over to my wife and my very best friend, Lisa.
Hello. Let's continue talking about the children's education. The third question to answer regarding your children's education is, what is our educational philosophy? There are several different approaches you can take to education, and thankfully we have the freedom to choose the one we like, or even better, to combine different aspects of several approaches to create your own hybrid. First, textbook workbook approach. This approach uses graded textbooks and workbooks like most of us probably use during our public or private school years. I imagine we're all familiar with reading a chapter, answering questions at the end, taking a few quizzes, and finally having a larger exam that covers a unit of chapters. This approach can offer a lot of structure and keep your children on the same schedule as their public and private school peers, if that's important to you. And this is usually the choice of most public schools and private schools because it seems to be the easiest way to teach a large number of students at once. A second approach to consider, unit studies. This is a thematic approach that groups a number of subjects such as science, history, geography, music, art, and others around a specific theme, which could be a block of scripture verses, or specific character qualities, or even a book. This philosophy demonstrates the connectedness of life and how one thing inevitably leads to another. You may be familiar with the book If You Give a Mouse a Cookie by Laura Joffe Numeroff. If you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to ask for a glass of milk. Then he's going to ask for a straw, then a napkin. Then he wants to check for a milk mustache, and when he sees his reflection, he realizes he needs a haircut, and on and on and on. Unit studies is a multi-grade teaching approach, so all your kids can study the same thing at the same time, but be on different grades and levels. It's important to note that unit studies takes a lot of time and work on the parent's part, and you often must add a number of basic subjects to the curriculum, such as phonics, math, penmanship, and possibly others. A third philosophy to consider is the classical approach. This approach applies the method of the trivium used by the Greeks and the Romans, and it's divided into 3 stages which correspond with the child's natural readiness to learn in these different areas. First, there's the grammar stage, or the elementary years, where the child does a lot of early learning and memorizing. Next, the logic stage, which corresponds with junior high, when the child begins to reason and make analogies. And finally, the rhetoric stage during the high school years, where the child learns to communicate thoughts and ideas persuasively. This approach does a good job of teaching thinking and communicating skills, both written and verbal. Finally, I'd like to talk about the Charlotte Mason method, named for a British educator who lived in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The Charlotte Mason method is a literature-based liberal arts approach to education. And in this method, short lessons are used to enhance concentration, especially in the elementary years. Textbooks are replaced with wonderful literature, and written tests are replaced with narration, which is simply having the child tell back in his own words what he just read. One of Charlotte Mason's mottos was, "Education is an atmosphere, a discipline, a life." Now, there are a couple of other basic educational philosophies that I'm not going to talk about, but you can do an internet search if you're interested in either the principal approach or in unschooling. So those are 4 educational philosophies to consider. Now let's get back to our 8 questions. And the next one is, what are our children's learning styles? What's the quickest way they can learn new information? And see if you can identify yours as I describe them. First, there's the visual learner, who learns best with his eyes. He has to see it to own it. This is the child who can remember that his brother's tennis shoes are behind the door in the upstairs bathroom. He can see it in his mind. Or if he's looking for a passage in a book, he won't remember what page it's on, but he remembers it's on the bottom of the right-hand side. That's a visual learner. Visual learners are concrete learners that often have difficulty reading between the lines. They are motivated by lists and charts and stickers, and they're distracted by visuals. So if your visual learner is trying to study in a room where the door is open, and there's a heavy line of traffic going past that open door, a visual learner is going to feel compelled to look up every time there's somebody there to see. Now let's talk about the auditory learner. An auditory learner learns best with his ears. He has to hear it to get it. He can effortlessly remember poems, jingles, songs, movie lines, portions of books that are read out loud. This is often your talker, your hummer, or your whistler. Auditory learners are motivated by verbal compliments and distracted by background noise. And finally, the kinesthetic learners or hands-on learners. These folks learn best through movement. They're often called wiggle worms. They seem to be in perpetual motion, and they excel at work done with their hands. They're motivated by hugs and pats on the back, and they're distracted when they have to sit still. Now let me make a few additional points about these learning styles. First of all, most of us begin as kinesthetic learners, but the time we hit 6 or so, we settle into primarily one of these 3 learning styles. And while it's important and helpful to know your children's learning styles, your learning style, your spouse's learning style, because this helps all of you learn new subject and material in a quick and easy manner, I want to caution you, make sure you use them as tools and not labels. We don't want our kids thinking they can't learn by any other method than their one learning style, because we all must learn to read and understand, to listen quietly, and to sit still. Now, some curricula on the market are written with specific learning styles in mind, while other curricula claim to cover all 3 learning styles. But honestly, any material can be adapted to any learning style with a little understanding and creativity. The 5th question to ask about your children's education is, which subjects should we teach and which books and curricula should we use? And the quick answer is, it depends. It depends on the educational philosophies you choose, the ages of your children, the number of your children, your family goals. Obviously, you're going to cover the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And from there, it depends on the goals for your children and their education. As they get older, it will depend on what your children want to do in life. College goals will require a specific path. Military goals may require a different path. Entrepreneurial goals could lead them in a totally different direction. So your subjects and the materials that you choose to use in your homeschool will depend on your goals, and different families will make different choices. Please keep this in mind when you're discussing homeschooling materials with your homeschooling friends and family members, because the books they choose, no matter how desperately they love them, won't necessarily be best for your kids, especially if you're following a different educational philosophy. And honestly, it's best to not even look at books and curricula until you've settled on your educational philosophy or philosophies you want to use. Because until you know what you want to build, you're not going to know which tools to use. Okay, the 6th question. How much time will home education require? Quick answer, a lot. When you home educate your children, you become the teacher, the principal, the entire board of education. So consider these aspects of home education. Reading and researching the educational philosophies and learning styles. Decision-making and buying of the books and materials. Planning the lessons and your school schedule. The actual teaching. Then the record keeping and the evaluating of progress and goals so you can prepare for another year. Not to mention all the other things we do, like meals, house cleaning, laundry, and on and on and on. Home education is a major time commitment. In itself, it's a full-time job. The 7th question regarding our children's education: when should the teaching take place? And the quick answer, continually. Teaching and learning take place constantly. It's about so much more than academics. If you taught your child to tie his shoes, you've home educated that child in shoelace tying. If you're trying to teach your children to put their dinner napkins in their laps and hold their utensils correctly, you're home educating your children in proper table manners. We all start out as home educators. Some of us simply choose to extend our home education to academia. Life is education. So please don't get locked into the idea that school or learning is only taking place when the math books are open and the pencils are busily scratching across the paper and the folders are getting thick with completed schoolwork. There is an enormous amount of learning that cannot be measured by a letter or a number grade. However, for the learning we do measure, let me say this about scheduling. We have the flexibility to teach whenever we choose. We're not required to keep the public or private schools' calendars. You're free to, but you don't have to. We can educate on Saturdays. We can educate through the summer. Vacations for homeschoolers often turn into one huge field trip. Here's an example for you. For as long as I can remember, we have focused on formal education the first 3 weeks of every month. And then we put away the books for the last week of the month, and we call this off week. And this is when we focus on projects such as writing, painting, music, sewing, photography, filmmaking, and countless other skills. We keep this schedule all year long, and we take breaks at holidays. This allows a break for our kids' brains. This gives me built-in planning time, and it also prevents that inevitable brain dump that happens every May. And finally, the 8th and last question regarding our children's education: where will we teach? And the quick answer is everywhere. With the tremendous freedoms that accompany homeschooling, we're not locked into those uncomfortable school desks. School can be inside or outside, at the dining room table, on the living room couch, at the library, in the car on errands, at the zoo, anywhere. You get the picture. So that covers the question for the children's education. Now let's talk a little bit about the parents' education. I tell people, when you send your kids away from home for their school work, they come home with homework. But when you keep your kids at home for school, you have the homework. So do your homework, parents. Here are 5 suggestions to help you. First of all, read, read, read. We've included a list of basic beginning homeschooling books in the handout. Second, keep reading. Find books in line with your educational philosophies so that you can get specific instruction in this area. Third, maybe subscribe to a homeschool magazine or 2. There are subscription details in the handout. Fourth, join a support group. There are many support groups affiliated with MHEA, and if you go to our website, mhea.net, and click on resources and then click on support groups, you'll find them listed by county. Support groups can be so helpful because through the relationships that you make there, you can find new friends, you can be encouraged in your homeschool journey, you can discover new resources, you can participate in a number of activities. And finally, fifth, get organized or begin to get organized. Think about organizing your space, your schedule, and your budget. We've listed some resources in the handout. Now, I'm turning this back over to Jeff.
Okay, we're going to now talk about the law, and I'm going to put my lawyer hat on. I'm a lawyer by vocation, and we want to talk about what Mississippi law requires. We would refer you to the handout for the written material on the law, but we're at least going to hit the highlights of it. One of the reasons we want to talk about the law is that, again, as a Christian organization, we want to encourage people to obey the law so long as it doesn't violate Scripture. Romans 13, in fact, tells Christians that we are to obey the law. So here are some of the high points of homeschooling law in Mississippi. First, home education is legal in Mississippi. It used to be that the question was always asked, is it legal? I think most people realize it's legal now. This is also a very favorable law that we have in Mississippi that's been around for quite some time, back into the mid to late 80s. Mississippi is a very good place to be because we have minimum regulation and maximum freedom as parents. Now, a child is compulsory school age who has attained the age of 6 and has not attained the age of 17 on or before September 1st. Now, if you enroll your child in a 5-year-old program, there are some limitations about being able to withdraw them and things like that. So if that's where you want to go, you'll need to do a little bit of digging in that. But generally speaking, compulsory age is 6 to 17. Now, when a child is compulsory education age, that's when the parents have to fill out certificates of enrollment for them. Now, for clarity, you don't have to wait until a child is compulsory age to start teaching them. My youngest child was reading when he was 3 years old, which is not surprising since he had 4 older siblings and 2 parents reading to him all the time. So you don't have to wait until they're 6, but you must begin the formal process when they turn 6. Now, the required days of instruction, it's a little bit unclear under Mississippi law. We recommend that you keep a simple record to show that you have instructed your children in academics the same number of days, at least the same number of days, as the public and private school system, which is 180 days per year. Again, the statute's not crystal clear, but this kind of record keeping is probably a safe thing to do just in case any questions should be asked. Now, as far as this 180-day aspect is concerned, one thing you will find is that you will probably accomplish more in 3 to 4 hours than most systems do in an entire day. Home education is very efficient. Now, why is this? Well, in a non-homeschool setting, one teacher usually has 30 or more students. And even the best teacher cannot discern each child's learning style and then adapt the teaching to each child's learning style. So teaching is often aimed toward the middle common denominator. And this is not the fault of the teachers at all. This is just the nature of the system. And for kids who aren't doing well in that system, what is the usual answer? Well, normally you hire a tutor, because one-on-one the material can be geared toward the way the child learns best. Well, if you think about it, home education is simply the tutorial method applied to all subjects. So this is one of the reasons why home education is extremely efficient. And so even if you do 180 days or more, you will find that you will accomplish more in each of those days than would be the case in another system. Now, another point to pick up is that there are no required subjects that we have to teach in Mississippi. Parents have the absolute freedom to decide the subject matter that they are taught. But when it's time for high school, we strongly encourage you to do an internet search for Homeschool Legal Defense Association's high school and beyond pages. You won't find a better resource for homeschool high school planning. Now, here in Mississippi, you need to locate your student attendance officer to get a certificate of enrollment. And you need to fill that certificate out and turn it back in to the attendance officer. And the phone number for the Department of Education to find out who your attendance officer is area code 601-359-3178. This is Mississippi Department of Education's compulsory school attendance law. And my wife has been very impressed with their friendliness and helpfulness. Certificates of enrollment must be filled out for children who reach the age of 6 on or before September 1 and have not attained the age of 17 on or before September 1. The certificates of enrollment are due by September 15 of each year, and you should fill one out for each child that meets the age requirements for every year that you home educate. So it's not as though you can fill out one form at age 6 and that carries you through. It's not like that at all. So if you have 4 children, you're going to have to fill out 4 certificates of enrollment for each year that they are subject to compulsory education. And where the form asks for a simple description of educational program for home instruction, your answer can be as simple as a list of the subjects you plan to teach that year, or as complicated as the list of books and curricula that you plan to use. Now, once you've filled out each child's certificate of enrollment for the year, we suggest that you make a copy of it for your own records, especially if you plan to mail those in. And if you choose to mail them in, you might want to do it a little early and go the extra mile and send them by certified mail, return receipt requested, just so that there is proof that it was received. Now, the state of Mississippi doesn't require parents to have any teacher qualifications. You don't have to have a teacher certificate or even a college degree. And Mississippi law does not require that students take standardized achievement tests if they are homeschooled. That being the case, many homeschool parents do choose to have their children take standardized tests from time to time as a way of measurement, but you do not have to do that. Now, although Mississippi is one of the friendliest homeschool states, we strongly recommend that you join Homeschool Legal Defense Association. This is a group of lawyers in Virginia who have been around since the early 80s, and all they do is focus on home education. And although Mississippi's law is favorable toward home education, there are times when government officials sometimes step out of line, sometimes unknowingly, and HSLDA will need to get involved to help at times. There was a situation in one county in Mississippi where a chancery court judge, on his own, issued an order compelling all homeschoolers within his jurisdiction to provide the names, birth dates, and social security numbers of their homeschool children. Well, Homeschool Legal Defense Association jumped in, filed the appropriate papers with the Mississippi Supreme Court, and that order was reversed very, very quickly. So Homeschool Legal Defense Association is a very active and effective homeschool organization. I don't know what the current price is. It's usually around $115 per year, but you can become a member of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and that membership will give you free legal representation at no additional cost if you have any issues regarding homeschooling. Now, again, I'm a lawyer, and I'm going to tell you, you can't get a lawyer to breathe on your file or sit down and talk to you for 115, 120, 25, whatever the cost is right now. So this really is a bargain. They will also provide you with assistance if there are social contacts. If a social worker shows up on your doorstep, you can ask them to stay there, grab your phone, call HSLDA, and HSLDA will then talk to the social worker. They also provide information by email and internet when homeschool freedoms are threatened. So again, we strongly encourage you to join HSLDA. And even if you never have to use their services, you are supplementing them so that they can help homeschoolers in other states where there is far more governmental challenge to home education than we have in Mississippi. Now, if you are considering switching educational tracks during the year and pulling your child out of public or private school in order to homeschool them, you'll want to read the section of our handout on how to do this. We don't want to take the time to discuss it during the speech, but you'll certainly need to be aware of the various things that you need to do. So those are the 3 points of the education aspect of home education: the children's education, the parents' education, and the law. Now, the second portion of the presentation, which isn't as long as the first, but is just as important, if not more so, the other basic and central element of home education is the home. Now, perfection in all of these areas that I'm about to talk about isn't required in order to home educate. Adam and Eve made sure there were no perfect homes. What we're looking for, however, is progress. And these are areas that will affect your endeavor in home education academics one way or another. The way the tenor of the home is and things you do within the home will in fact affect the academics. The first one I want to talk about would be the personal relationships. First of all, your relationship with the Lord, or the lack of a relationship with the Lord, that's going to affect your home education efforts. I said this earlier, but as Christians, Lisa and I wouldn't dream of going forward with home education without a very clear call and conviction from the Lord. So we encourage you to ask yourselves, have we prayed about home education? Are we sure that this is what the Lord wants us to do? And then a second relationship is the relationship between the spouses, if there's a spouse in the home. This is the subject of marriage. Homeschooling is very time-consuming, and it's very easy, especially for the spouse that's doing the bulk of the academic work, to neglect the other spouse as the focus is placed on the children's education. We've listed some helpful books on the topic in our handout. Your church may have good resources, but we at least wanted to mention that as something for you to consider. Now, once again, we're not saying that you must have a perfect marriage to home educate. Otherwise, there would be no home educators. But your relationship with your spouse will have a huge impact on your homeschooling efforts, either positively or negatively. I mean, kids seem to have this built-in meter they can pick up on friction between mom and dad. And so if dad is going along with this homeschooling experiment grudgingly, what kind of signal does that send to the kids? And so if the kids don't want to be homeschooled and they find out that dad is only grudgingly going along with this, they're going to exploit that kind of friction. So ask yourself, what is my relationship with my spouse like? Are we unified on this decision to home educate? Are the spouses encouraging and supporting one another in this endeavor? Now, let me pause a minute here and just talk to the dads as man to man. Even if your wife is doing most of the academic teaching, you are more than the figurehead principal of the school. You need to be active. I said earlier, you can seize on teachable moments. You can sit down and read primers with your children. There are things you can do. You can review material with your children. It's been my practice in the evening to ask what the children were doing in school. And it helps me to understand what they're learning, and it helps to reinforce it in their minds. You can also review curricula as much as possible. Make the purchase of curricula a joint decision. Don't put the burden of that completely on your wife and then turn around and blame her if a curriculum isn't working well. Also, step in if your wife is bogged down and can't see the forest for the trees. Be an objective sounding board and a counselor. When the kids were really, really little, there were a handful of times where Lisa was, two of the kids were throwing up and somebody was knocking on the door and the phone was ringing off the hook, and she was concerned that schooling's not happening today. And I was able to tell her, look, let's just take school off today. We'll make it up on Saturday, or we'll do something else. You need to be able to take that pressure off of her to prevent her from getting burned out. And one thing I've noticed in recent years that very much bothers me is that I've seen men basically cracking the whip. They don't feel that their wives are getting the kids ready for college fast enough or well enough. And I had one dad came to me and he said, I just don't think my son's going to be ready for college at age 18. And I looked at him and I said, where is it written that your son has to start college at age 18? And he looked at me like I'd hit him with a 2x4. You see, we let the world conform us to these different things, but there is no reason why we can't think outside the box, and why a son couldn't work for a year after graduating from high school before going to college and boning up on material in the interim. There are many, many different ways that can be handled. But the point is, don't crack the whip on your wife and cause her to burn out on home education. Also, I would encourage you to keep your kids from time to time. Not just keeping them from getting hurt, not just crowd control, but actually try teaching them. Try to do what your wife does in the course of a day. It will be a significant reality check. I remember when the kids were little, I would sometimes on a Saturday say, honey, you need a break, go out, you take the day off, I'll take care of the kids. Oh my word, it was quite a reality check for me. And she would come home at the end of the day, and I would just want to throw myself on the ground and wrap my arms around her and say, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Because I don't know how she gets anything done during the course of the day. The constant interruptions. I mean, it was just, so you need to make sure that you give your wife an opportunity to retool, to refresh herself, give her breaks. And then another thing I would like to say to you men is that biblically, what happens in your home is your responsibility. Your wife may bear blame, but you are ultimately responsible when things go wrong. Ephesians 6:4 says that fathers are to train their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And so the finger is placed squarely on us. So what our wives are doing is largely helping us carry out this mission. And when we stand before the judgment seat of Christ, we can't blame any failure on our wives, though again, our wives may be culpable in some respects. We can't say, the woman thou gavest me failed at this. I mean, Adam tried that in the garden. He tried blaming Eve. God didn't accept that excuse from him, and he's not going to accept that excuse from us. And then a third area of relationship, you and your spouse's relationship with your children, child rearing. Now, this is not a child rearing workshop. We can't get into all of that. But if your children are not characterized by obedience now, Again, we're not saying they have to be perfectly obedient, but if they're not characterized by obedience, then it's pretty likely that you will not be able to teach them math or any other subject. Home education is not a magic wand that you bring them home or protect them from the outside influences and all of a sudden everything is hunky-dory. It just doesn't work that way. Even kinesthetic children have to be taught to sit still. And so as you teach academics, you also need to be teaching and training your children to obey you and to honor you, that it may go well with them, which is exactly what the fifth commandment says. And we've listed some resources on the subject in the handout. Again, your church may have resources as well. So just ask yourself, are my children characterized by obedience? How are my spouse and I doing on training our children to obey immediately and cheerfully? I would laugh if it weren't so serious when I see parents, and I've seen this before, they count to 10. They'll give an instruction and the child does nothing and they start counting to 10 and the child doesn't even start to move until you get to 8 or 9. Well, back that up all the way to 1 and things will go much better for you and for your children. So ask yourselves, are we consistent in encouraging our children, building them up, spending time with them, as well as being consistent in biblical correction and discipline of disobedience? And you know, this really points out another important component of home education. It's not just the academics that we're after. It's Christian character. It's the hearts of our children for Christ. We don't want our children growing up to become brilliant astrophysicists who are practical atheists. I heard a guy interviewed a number of years ago, and this has stuck with me. He was being interviewed on the radio, and back in the 80s, their son had been labeled with a learning dysfunction. Well, the parents really didn't think the child had a learning dysfunction. They just thought he wasn't being taught in the right way. And so back before home education became mainstream, they brought him home and they home educated him. And this child who had been labeled with a learning disability around the age of 16 or 17 finished high school and went to Harvard or one of the other Ivy League schools. I don't remember which. But the thing that struck me more about it is that this man sat his son down and he said, "Son, you have been given incredible blessings and benefits by being home educated. You have a stellar academic background. But if you leave our home and you go off to college and you get a job and you cure cancer, or you become an astronaut, or you do President of the United States or something like that, and don't honor Jesus Christ, we will consider everything that we have been done to be a failure." Wow, that made a huge, huge impact on me. That this is really more than just academics. It's about the heart of our children for Christ. Again, we're not looking for perfection, but we're looking for progress in this area. And then a fourth area of relationships would be your children's relationship with each other. How do they respond and react to one another? I heard another speaker actually who spoke at our homeschool conference a number of years ago, and he gave this scenario. He said, imagine you have two boys and they're sitting at the table and you're trying to teach them math, and they start kicking each other under the table. If your focus is on academics, you'll wait on the training and you'll finish the math lesson. If your focus is on the hearts of your children and their relationship with each other, you'll stop the math lesson and you'll deal with the training, and then you'll go back to the math lesson. And we've always been guided in our home by Psalm 133:1 about how good and pleasant it is when brothers live together in harmony. So what are the sibling relationships like? And many of the resources we have listed on child training will cover this as well. And it's been just a real joy to me to see all 5 of my children. They're really best friends with each other, from the oldest to the youngest. And they have good times with each other, and they enjoy talking to each other. Yes, they have their differences. They are not perfect, but generally speaking, they are good friends with one another. So if we're diligent in the basics, the academics are largely going to come. If we focus on these relationships and a well-centered home grounded in Christ, to a large degree, the academics will come. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7 says that it's the fear of the Lord that is the beginning of wisdom. So we want to give our children a fear of the Lord, a proper respect for the Lord. We want to demonstrate that respect for the Lord ourselves, and from that will come wisdom. And then finally, as far as relationships are concerned, family activities, traditions, things of this nature. What do you do together as a family? Do you eat dinner together at night around the table and talk to each other? Do you have a night or two each week set aside for family activities, such as playing games or perhaps watching appropriate movies or sporting events? These are just some random examples. Do you have special holiday traditions that you observe? Baking together, singing carols, working at an inner city mission, or whatever that might be in your context. So ask yourself, what activities or ministries can we participate in as a family? And the reason I focus on this is many homeschoolers feel the need to prove themselves, especially academically. Be careful that you don't do school 10 hours a day and have no fun. Remember that you're a home, you're a family. Don't cause your children to dread homeschooling. In fact, Lisa and I have wanted to make home education such a positive experience for our children that they would want to homeschool our grandchildren. Now, there's a lot more that we could talk about: the atmosphere of the home, the type of music that's played, the TV programs and videos that are watched. You know, it really doesn't do a whole lot of good to pull them out of public or private school to protect them from negative influences, only to pipe those same negative influences in through music and television and videos. The amount of time spent on the telephone, especially by mom, for example, if she spends all of her time on the phone, it sort of sets a wrong priority for the kids that homeschooling is not important. All of these things and dozens of others that we don't have time to talk about set a tone in the home for either good or for ill. And so think about the influences that you bring into your home and the way you conduct yourselves within your home. And then I just want to conclude by sort of wrapping this up with a few reminder points. I think we've already covered a lot of this, but remember that you're a home, you're a family first, and a school second. Also, enjoy your children. They're not just your pupils. Parenting and home education are big jobs. They're often tough jobs, but they have innumerable rewards and blessings if we remember to keep the proper things in focus. So spend time with your children, not just teaching them academics, but spend time getting to know them. One of the ways I got to learn my children's learning styles is I got on the floor and I played with them with Legos, and I played dolls, and I played marbles, and I did games, and I did all those kinds of things. And so I had a good time with them. I learned about them. They enjoyed it, and I got to learn something about the way they learn that we were then able to translate into the learning styles to help on the academic side. So don't be so tunnel visioned about this great adventure that you lose sight of the fact that your students are also your children. God's blessings to you. Well, we hope this has been helpful to you, and so we'll just commit this to the Lord, and God bless you as you go on the home education journey. Thank you.